Have you ever had a moment when you found out the world worked a little bit differently than you thought it did? Maybe when you learned something that you weren't expecting to learn. I get a lot of mileage out of my first year of ministry because I was an associate pastor for a parish of churches, and I learned a lot that year. Straight out of college, fresh with a degree, and thinking I knew exactly everything I needed to know until I got to Texas. And everything they tell you about Texas is really is true. It's like a whole other country down there. And so I get down there, and there was a men's group that would meet, and we'd get together early on a Saturday morning. We'd have a Bible study, then we'd go up to the local cafe and we'd have breakfast. One thing that was held true through all of that is my undying love of biscuits and gravy. That was a regular staple up there. But we would go in there, and the guys would start to talk a little bit about what was going on. And one of these guys started talking about these pools that he was putting in. I sat there and listened to this, and he'd talk about these, and this went on for like a couple of months. He was talking about these pools, and the trouble that they were having with these pools, and trying to get the overflow right, and trying to get things worked out so that they would fill correctly. And I'm sitting there in my mind, I'm thinking, well, I know your wife's a retired school teacher, and you are a retired teacher and a farmer, and did they really pay you all that much down here when you were teaching school that you were putting in not one but multiple pools? Finally, one day I stopped and probably did the thing I should have done long before that. I stopped and I said, Mike, what do you mean when you're talking about pools? He stopped, he looked at me for a second. The other guys were sitting around there. You could see kind of one by one as the light bulbs went off in their head. They remembered, oh yeah, he's a Midwestern boy. He ain't from around here. He looked at me and he said, what do you go fishing in? What do you let where all your water drains off to? What the cattle go when they drink out of when they need to? And I said, you talking about a pond? He said, yes, that's what we've been talking about all this time. Were ponds. They just call them pools down there. I'm looking at him going, it took me way too long to do the smart thing and ask you what all you were talking about. Had these wonderful, beautiful images of these great pools, and I couldn't figure out how in the world they were making that work. But no, it's just what we'd expect them to be from around here. Just a couple of ponds he was putting in for the cattle that he had. And you ever had those moments when you learned something new, kind of like that? Hopefully you didn't feel quite as dumb as I felt in the middle of that, but I mean, it happens sometimes to us. And as we get older, we learn that things are a little bit different as we age and we learn more. And I won't say as we become more mature, because I'm trying to avoid that one at all costs. And sometimes I'm even successful at it. But we realize that how we learn things as kids often is appropriate for kids. But as we get older, there's new things that we have to learn. Things like nuance and logic and reason and reasoning and motivations, and all those things go into there, because things are very rarely as adults as clear cut as they are when we're kids. When we're kids and we don't have like all of those abstract functioning parts of our brain yet that they haven't quite kicked into gear, we learn very concrete things. It's either right or it's wrong. It's either yes or no. That's the way that the world works, because that's all that we can handle. As we get older, we figure out that things are a little bit different than that, and we have to be ready to adapt and change. Otherwise, we might end up being really confused about someone's pool and trying to figure out what's going on. And that's important for us to remember as we approach this question of why Jesus? Why should we have faith in Jesus? Because when we do that, one of the most important things that we have to be able to talk about, like really talk about and discuss and understand, is what is sin? What is sin when we are talking about who Jesus is, and why does it feature so prominently in our faith? Sin, when we're first learning about it, is knowing what to do and what not to do. Like the very beginnings of that, when we're little or we're new to the faith, it's like, all right, what do we do, what don't we do? Because that's where we can begin to kind of understand things, because that's what we have the capacity for. Especially when we're younger. But as we grow older, as we grow in faith, that should change in many of the same ways that so much of our understanding of things does. It should grow and it should progress, and it should move beyond being just about specific actions and things that are right or wrong. should become more inclusive of many more things that we know are sinful, not because of the actions themselves, but because of why we're doing them. Remember that sin, so much of it is the actions that happen are the effects of sin. They aren't the things that are sinful. They're the effects of the sin that has already happened. They're what occurs because we have sinned. Even when we look at things like the Ten Commandments, oftentimes we're presented with them as being, here are the list of here's the things you do and here's the things you don't do. And if you can hold on to this list, then life is good. Except remember where all of this came from. Remember what the Israelites were dealing with as Moses was receiving these commandments from God, and then in turn as he was giving them to the people. They had come out of a place when they were enslaved in Egypt where things were right or wrong. And they were right or wrong depending on who it was who was in charge of you that day. And if you were wrong, you typically got hurt for it, because that was just the way their world worked. And so it was right or wrong, and they had someone else who was telling them that, and that was the world that they knew. Coming out of that, things had to be different. They had to learn differently. They had to be different. They were trying to build a community, to build a nation, to build a people, something they hadn't had in generations upon generations. And so they needed to know, what does it mean to be in a relationship with God? What does it mean to be in a relationship with one another? And so these commandments are given to help them begin to figure that out. With just enough structure so that they can know, so that they can feel comfortable with what was going on, because it looked just enough like what they were used to, but a whole lot of space in there for them to figure this out, to figure out who they were supposed to be. And they were learning that through these commandments. So sin needs to take on a different meaning. The hard part, though, is that labeling something either as right or wrong makes life so much easier. I mean, I wish I could just go through and I knew here are the 10 things that I needed to do every day and the 10 things I didn't need to do every day, and if I could handle that, then life would be good. Life is easier when we can put very specific labels on things and we can know exactly what is right and what is wrong. But the trouble with that is that becomes very easy to abuse over time. In fact, this is what we see Jesus leading folks out of in the Gospels. When he had a bunch of folks who, a very small group of the religious leaders of the time, were very good at determining what was right and what was wrong, and they became the arbiters of truth in the middle of that, and depending on who you talk to, things might change just a little bit. And Jesus said, no, we can't have that. That's not how this works, because they were abusing their power in the midst of that. Paul was doing the same thing. He, a little bit different context. When he gets to Rome, and our scripture reading this morning comes out of the book of Romans, and we're going to spend some time in 1 John, and it was kind of a toss-up in my head. Which reading do I use? We went with Romans because Paul gives a lot of examples, and he doesn't stop there. He continues on through the rest of chapter 1 into chapter 2. Like, no one comes out unscathed in Paul's writings. Like, we're all at some point going, ooh, Paul had one hit a little close to home. But Paul, in writing to the Romans, was writing to folks who were used to living with a whole lot of gods all the time and all around them. And these were folks that knew what gods you celebrated, on what days, what feasts were offered, what sacrifices or what offerings were made for that. They knew that if they were going through these problems, this was who you went to and this is how you approached it. And they even were really good at, if they needed something else, they knew how to play one god off of another. I mean, like, this is just the world that they lived in. And so they knew how this all worked. And Paul writes to them and says, y'all, let me show you something different. This isn't a way to try and do things. So what is sin? Sin, as Paul begins to describe it in chapter 1, is injustice. It is ungodly behavior. It is knowing God, but choosing differently. It is narcissism. It is self-corruption. Like I said, that list can go on and on. I think we kind of get the picture. This is where I like out of 1 John kind of gives a great kind of just a way of pulling all of this together. In 1 John chapter 3, verse 4, Paul, I'm trying to get this pulled up so the folks online can see this also, the writer says this: every person who practices sin commits an act of rebellion, and sin is rebellion. Now there's a couple of words to hold on to in there. Hold on to the word practice for a while. We're going to come back to that. But the one now to really think about is this word rebellion. Sin is rebellion. In other translations, we're taking this out of the Common English Bible translation. In the NRSV or the NIV or the King James, instead of rebellion, it'll say lawlessness. Both are accurate translations of that, but I like rebellion better because I think it gets to what is driving this. That it is not just about did you follow the law or not follow the law, but it is, are you rebelling? Are you coming against the things that you aren't supposed to be? It's more emphatic. It's more inclusive. It's a bigger term that actually fits with how we live. Sin is rebellion. Sin is living without grace. Not that God's not giving grace, but it's a willful act of choosing to live as if He's not giving that grace. It's a life that doesn't know who God is. And so what does sin do? Sin at its heart corrupts the self. It corrupts who we are. It causes harm to ourselves. It causes harm to others. And sin can happen through our actions and our inactions. When we label things as either right or wrong, inactions then don't figure into that. We either did something or we didn't do something, and that's how that goes. But this brings in more of that. Even through our inactions, then we can sin. It's one of the biggest changes that comes through what Jesus is teaching. We can not do anything, and we can still sin. Now here's where it gets to be a little bit more of a challenge even, because the first response generally comes and says, well, what happens then when we know someone is sinning and we want to correct them or call them out or do any of that, but we might cause more harm to them in the process of it, right? Do we go ahead and do it? Are we sinning then if we do that? And if we intervened and we cause more harm, are we sinning ourselves? The thing to remember, though, when we are trying to do that, and we're doing that with the best of our intentions, trying to do that well, we aren't causing more harm. We're trying to bring harm to an end. Is that our goal? Trying to bring that harm to an end, trying to change what it is that's causing that. Then in that moment, we aren't the ones causing the harm. We aren't sinning. We're trying to find a solution that brings it to a stop. But that can be a hard question to answer. As an example, Todd Bolsinger, he wrote the book called Canoeing the Mountains. If you were at council meeting or our planning retreat and part of the church council a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic, so I'm pretty sure none of us remember that except for me, because that's been a couple of decades ago when we did this. We watched a little bit of him kind of talking, and I like Todd because he's one of the guys that gets it right now. He's not trying to recycle old things that weren't working before and try and package them up and say, hey, just do this now and everything's going to be fine. He's wrestling with the big questions. And he tells a story one time that he was in a situation where he had his best friend who was an alcoholic. Now, he didn't think he was. His friend didn't think that he was. And this was the guy where Todd says, I like to go drinking with him. We had a good time when we would go out and life was good. He said his wife came to him one day and said, Todd, you can't keep doing this. He's got a problem. He's like, no, he doesn't. He doesn't have a problem. And so they kept going on for a while. And finally his friend's family came back to him again and said, you've got a choice here. Either you can stop drinking with him or you can stop being his friend. That's the choice you've got here. And the question would be, is the family in this situation causing harm because they might be breaking up a long, good friendship? Or in reality, what they were doing was they were trying to work to bring that harm to an end. And Todd writes, and he says, we changed after that. He said, I didn't want to lose my friend, but I had to be different after that. I had to change also. And so his family, by coming into that, brought that harm to an end. Even though it hurt in the short term, it was the right thing that needed to happen. Another example of that we can see comes from the story of the woman at the well. When Jesus came up, there was the middle of the day, no one else was out there, and all of the religious leaders would have said Jesus should never have hung out with this woman. One, she was Samaritan, so that was already a knock against her. Two, she was a woman, so there was a second knock against her. Jesus didn't have a shot in any of this. But three, they knew all of her sins. Everyone knew all of her sins. And she was just not someone a good godly man like Jesus should ever go and hang out with. But he goes up, he sits down at the well with her, and they start talking. And Jesus does this thing that so often we would say, this is like, you don't do this when you first meet someone, Jesus. If Peter had been standing around there, it's probably what Peter would have said, because Peter can't help himself sometimes. And so Jesus looks at her and just looks her straight in the eyes and lays out all of the things that she had done wrong. And even in the moment, the things she was still doing wrong. And you would think that's got to be like the most painful thing. Here's this perfect stranger comes up to you and is sitting there and is telling you how awful a person you are. You would think that's going to be like the wrong thing that Jesus should do. Except that in that moment, she changes. She becomes different. For her, it wasn't harm that Jesus was doing, it was freeing. Letting her go, letting her let loose of all of the things that were holding her back. And didn't just change her, but changed the community that was around her, because she goes off and she tells everyone else, says, here's the guy that told me everything that I was doing wrong, and by golly, I'm different now because of it. Changed so many lives in that day. Jesus was recognizing the harm that had been done already. Naming the things was painful, but Jesus in the moment was fixing the injustice, the ungodly behavior, the narcissism, the self-corruption, all of those things that was a part, not just of what the woman had done, but the other's condemnation of her. So what is sin? Sin at its core is rebellion, characterized by deliberately pulling yourself away or pulling others away from God. But sin can be overcome. It can be overcome through grace, it can be overcome through forgiveness, it can be overcome through practice. Next week we're going to talk about what does forgiveness look like, but for now, look at that first part of it. How do we begin to put sin back in its place? Go to verse 7 in 1 John. Little children, make sure no one deceives you. The person who practices righteousness is righteous in the same way that Jesus is righteous. There's the old joke that goes out. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. I mean, it's an old joke now, and maybe even a lot of kids go, Carnegie Hall, what's that? And but that's the old joke, but it's practice. It's a lot of practice to get there. Here's the thing about practice, is that you don't accidentally do that. Like, you may sit down at a piano one day, I did this a couple of times, but somewhere pretty quick in there you realize, oh, I'm practicing because I'm doing these things wrong, and so I'm going to work on fixing what's going on. It is an active choice to do those things. Sin is our choice, and there will always be times when we sin. This is the beauty about how Jesus presents this to us. He says, I know you're going to do it. I know, to go back where we started this off, sometimes you're going to think what someone's talking about is a pool, and you're going to have all the wrong ideas about this until you figure out that they're really talking about a pond. But that's just going to be a thing that's going to happen. But Jesus says, go and practice righteousness. Because we've got a choice. We can practice righteousness knowing that sometimes we're going to sin in the midst of it and know that that's okay, but our intent is still to continue to try and do the thing that we're called to do. Or we can practice sin. This is the next verse. And there we can practice sin. And sometimes maybe even do a few good things along the way, but our intent is still wrong. Let us be a people, as we prepare to go from here today, that go and we practice righteousness. Knowing that sometimes we're going to get it wrong, knowing that sometimes we're still going to sin, but knowing that this is what Christ calls us to. And when we live this kind of life, there is room for grace, there is room for forgiveness, there is space for us to figure this out, knowing that God goes with us. Let us be a people that practice that kind of righteousness. And let us go and do that and share that with all those who are around us, and let us do that in His name. Amen.